Yesterday, we took a look at something that I thought was interesting coming from Ian in this group interview they did with Wowhead. This is not really alpha, but I do think that this will be the last like actual alpha post I make for a while now. I have another video I want to do tomorrow, and then we have back to streaming on Tuesday. But this was very interesting, and this is kind of like I said, blurring the lines. Not really alpha. This is more about kind of just design philosophy, and I think you could learn a lot about what the game is going to look like, what you should expect to be supported parts of the game, and like we said in the last video, what the reality of the game's development actually is. Because, if you're at odds with that, that might be something to reconcile. That's the way I look at it, at least. A lot of people just kind of lash out and say Blizzard's out of touch or whatever this nonsense is. But yeah, I mean, this is the guy who is responsible for most of the decision making the game is going to undertake. And I think, you could at least learn from that perspective, whether or not you agree with it. So this is him talking about Mythic plus dungeons, and yeah, I definitely am a little weirded out by some of these comments and questions and comments. So let's take a look at this. Can you explain your intentions with the new expansion as far as the Mythic Plus pool is concerned? You guys are obviously experimenting with bringing back keys from previous expansions now. And I just want to know if you guys plan on continuing that, or is this something that you guys are waiting to hear feedback on in this last season? And this is gonna be the start of a trend here. Like, that's a really weird question to ask the guy. You can ask him any question, and you're gonna be like, "Hey, you know that thing you announced 2 months ago? You still planning on doing that?" Yeah, that would be it would be ridiculous for them to say, "Actually, we're not gonna do that anymore." Anyway, his response is, "For sure, that's the path we're gonna take for Dragonflight Season 1. As expected. We're already well underway on updating old dungeons. The plan is a pool of 8 dungeons for the first Mythic Plus season, 4 new Dragonflight dungeons, as well as some old fan favorites from across the years. A couple of examples are going to be Temple of Jade Serpent, not Sethralis, Temple of Jade Serpent, and Mists of Pandaria, or from Mists of Pandaria, and the Court of Stars from Legion. So everyone can go back and play Guess Who again. Kind of trolling the reader here. But I love Core Stars. If you guys didn't see the video I made on my I ranked every single dungeon that had Mythic Plus. Number 1 overall was Court of Stars, and I'm really glad to see that back. You know what would not be number 1 overall? Temple of the Jade Serpent. That's actually an awful Mythic Plus. It's going to be a really strange one because the way the right side room works, well, I think let's put it this way. People who enjoy doing really crazy trash pulls, you're not really going to like this dungeon. But maybe I'm wrong about that because in towards the end of mob challenge modes, people were pulling basically the entire rooms, especially the one before the third boss. So there's just not a lot of trash in the dungeon, though. It's very, very kind of basic. And I don't like how the bosses work in there at all. I didn't like it in challenge mode. It was a very easy challenge mode because of that. It seemed like it was tuned around the RP, but you could easily play around it. So we'll see what happens. But I love the theme of that dungeon. It's definitely one of the nicest dungeons. Anyway, I think we're really excited to both revisit some old dungeons, but also have a structure where really a new Mythic Plus season can mean as much variety as a new raid tier. That's a very good way to put it. There will be new challenges, new rewards, and a whole new set of problems to solve, which also frankly serves as a little bit of community knowledge reset and makes for a smoother point of entry for players getting into the scene. And so actually, I just read a comment about this from one of my from a reply from the previous video. So I'm going to just point this out because whatever else is being said here, I want to focus on this. He says, I feel the plan for season 4 also seems to be much more for competitive players than for cooperative players. And so that's, I was going to make this video anyway, but now I'm definitely making it because this is like almost a direct response to that comment. But here it is. Even though we have new seasonal fixes, we've observed over the course of an expansion that it's challenging for people when you're 12 to 15 months in to do the same dungeons, to reach that same level of sophistication and refinement and community expectation for what you're supposed to know. Supposed to know. This is really, really, really crucial to this. It's so stratospherically high that it can be a rough experience for someone trying to get into later if you don't have a patient group of friends to help you. And I think we see this with Alex. If you guys have seen some of the stuff I've done with Alex Sensual while he's doing Mythic Plus keys, I think this is literally exactly what we're talking about here. Stratospherically high would be the way I would describe. This is so insightful. Actually, Ian is, I have to say, I don't know how long they gave him to answer these questions, like if it was just off the top, but these are like insanely insightful answers. He's so right about this, is the thing. Anyway, yeah, if you don't have a group of friends, this is I made a video on this basically about why you should come back now and not wait till Dragonflight, because you're going to come back and you're going to be overwhelmed by everything that's changed. And that is the same like line of thinking that is being expressed here by him. It's a different perspective though. They're changing the game to associate like players better. I'm saying you should just change the way you look at the game, and both can work. But obviously, they have a little bit more power behind theirs. Anyway, obviously, whether we stick with it, whether it becomes the future of Mythic Plus, that's going to depend how it plays out. What we hear from the community, and as always, we'll be listening and trying to refine. But so I think like this is actually something to keep in mind. So again, the original comment was, I feel the plan for season 4 also seems to be much more for the competitive players than the cooperative players. And so my response to that is no, it's the opposite. And it's basically Ian confirming it, but before that, my thought is that this kind of sucks as somebody like me, because I really like this part of it. I played the game for 12 to 15 months. It's a lot longer than that now. It's more like about a year and a half now at this point. I've been doing these dungeons for a year and a half now, so I don't feel like I should not be rewarded for that. You know what I mean? I like doing the same dungeon for a year and a half because by the end, it's a completely different dungeon than the beginning. And it's actually funny because of what happened with Grawl. Looking back at the season 1 stuff, you can actually see that. Like, the way Mists is handled in season 1 and the way Mist is handled in season 3, it's not even remotely the same. Now, part of that is the affixes, but also the nerfs and stuff. But part of that is just the power creep that we've gained in terms of a knowledge pool. And so for me, especially as a content creator, I also don't necessarily like that, because that means I have to now make, I have to rush to try to learn things that I can help you guys with. I think my value here on this landscape is I've done this content for a very, very long time, and I've done hundreds of runs of some of these dungeons. So I expect that to help me help you. But so now if we're doing Iron Dot, well, I've done these dungeons too, to be honest. So that's not that big of a deal. But in general, I just think it's not a really great. It's not great for me. So do you consider me a competitive player? I don't know. I mean, I play the game as a progression-oriented goal, but yeah, regardless, I'm not in favor of it. And I think they're literally saying here that, they're doing it to help people who are not competitive players. And so I think they're actually harming competitive players, like I said in the comment reply there, to hopefully benefit the greater part of the community and get them more into Mythic Plus. Now, there's a lot more to this, and now we get into a very weird part of the conversation. Again, I don't know who's asking these questions. It kind of worries me. Tanks have a lot of responsibility, especially in Mythic Plus. Yeah, that's true. The tank pool is sometimes really small. You sure about that? A lot of groups in LFG looking to wait for a tank. Yeah, okay. Is there anything you could think would be coming in Dragonflight to encourage tanking, especially when Evoker doesn't have a tank spec? And so, I mean, this is really just a bad question. That's honestly just a complete waste of time even asking this question. But he gives the most tactful response he can. This is something we talk about a lot. Evoker not having a tank spec, I think, is more a reflection on the fantasy of what being a draconic being is and how you would expect it to ask. A breath weapon and wings and mobility and all that felt like it lent itself more to a ranged class. Definitely agree with that. A caster's abilities don't always work well with tanking, so we didn't want to go in that direction with that fantasy. Future classes may have tank specs. Yeah. Oh, really? It's just like, why are you asking about that? It's so you're bleeding two completely different questions together, and it's just causing a really diluted answer. Even looking back historically, I don't know that we saw a massive increase in the number of tanks due to demon hunters existing. It doesn't even make sense. Why would you ask this question? Like, what do you think? Like, a bunch of DPSers are all of a sudden like, oh my god, I love Vengeance. I'm gonna check that out. I hated the other tanks though. That's not how it works. Like, people are already playing a tank, then they might switch from the tank they're playing to the new tank. It's not suddenly going to attract new people to tanking. You know what I mean? Like, okay, I mean, people are going to make evokers, right? But like, they're not going to make it because they want to play the healer, right? They're going to make it because it's an interesting class from the ground up. And maybe there's a small amount of people who end up falling in love with the healing spec over the DPS one, but like, unless you literally make the class only have a tank spec, that's just not the way it works. Anyway, and even I think people are really not aware of that. Like, nobody's really going to switch from being a DPS main to a tank main simply because a new spec is coming in the game. I mean, maybe there's some people, obviously, but that number is not significant. I really have to, I have to imagine that. Anyway, a lot of tanks may have switched specs or classes because they like the mobility or toolkit. Yeah, that's basically what he's saying. It's more of a mindset, wanting to be as responsible for survival, positioning, or leading a group through a dungeon. And yeah, that can be a very high barrier. So this is the real issue. It has nothing to do with specs or classes. To some extent, I think rotating the dungeon pool may help with that. And he's got a point, to be honest, because now you'll have less. And I'm telling you guys, if you are on the fence about this at all, start in season 4. Do not wait, because you're going to get a whole new perspective, and you'll all be relatively starting from the same point. As long as your character's not super undergeared, you will all be starting from the same point. Nobody's going to know these dungeons. That's part of why I'm not looking forward to it. You know, it's going to be very frustrating for me because I already know all the dungeons. There's going to be a lot more for me to learn, but it's going to be very frustrating watching people mess around with Grimrail Depot when nobody knows any of those frontal mechanics. It's going to be very frustrating, but if you are a new player, this is the perfect opportunity. Anyway, for some of the reasons I was saying earlier, part of the challenge is as a tank, you are expected to know the route, the pulls, where to clump mobs, etc. And if you're learning, unless you have a patient group of friends, you're learning at the expense of a group. And this is a really interesting thing to hear, because this is basically why I make YouTube videos. You don't want to do that. You do not want to learn at the expense of a group. You want to go in with the knowledge you already need and then figure out, like, knowledge is like, this is probably a terrible example. Knowledge is like clothing, okay? You have it all in your closet, but you don't wear it every single day. You know what I mean? But you can't go into a shop with no clothing at all and expect to be, able to pick out exactly what you want. You need to get the clothing first, then you decide where you use it. What a terrible example, by the way. Anyway, it's like the first thing that came to mind. Like, a closet full of items, and you pick the ones that are appropriate. But you need the closet filled with items first. You know what I mean? You can't go in and be like, oh, I need a shirt. Oh, man, now I got to go get the shirt. That's learning at the expense of the group. So you do not want to do that. You want to get the knowledge outside the game, then take it into the game and figure out where you need to apply it. And that is literally that is the core philosophy of why I make YouTube videos aimed at helping people learn Mythic Plus, because I want them to not and not only on top of that, like that's, he's stopping there, but that's not really, let's just read what else he says. Because while other roles have the ability to hang back and kind of follow along and pick up the knowledge that way. And so I think by lowering the barrier a little, hopefully we can make it more accessible. So he's basically saying, like, DPS and healers, they can kind of just let whatever happens and react to it. But the tank is the one making it happen. So they need to know where they're going and what they're doing. Like I always say, if the tank literally just stands still and never starts pulling anything, that dungeon's not upgradable. There's just no possible way to upgrade it without a tank, right? So, I mean, it's possible, but it's extremely, extremely unlikely. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that you can get that knowledge first and then go into it later and be able to apply that, and you'll be more successful. But if you choose not to do that, you are also, you have to do all this stuff. It'll be overwhelming. The game will be overwhelming. Game 1 will be overwhelming, but game 2 is going to destroy you, meaning the players, they're going to rail on you. They're going to be very critical of you. It's going to become super overwhelming emotionally, and you just will quit. I think that's really true, honestly. I think most people who probably, by the way, leave a comment on this if you are in this position. Have you ever tanked and felt like the people did not want you to tank? I mean, this happens to me all the time, and it's whatever, but at this point for me. But like, I'd imagine if you're new to tanking, especially if you played other roles or you played the game, somewhat aggressively in the past, but never tanking, it would be like, well, I'm not playing this role. It's just going to be easier to not have that happen as the other roles. So big issue. Anyway, we're also being mindful of tank gameplay itself, and we ask tanks to do in terms of our encounter design, especially in dungeons, with how much you're using your active mitigation, how much positioning matters, and how many other things you can do wrong as a tank. We're already expecting a ton from you. While in raid encounters, you might not be moving a lot as a tank, and you're focused on active mitigation and managing the boss of your own health. So that's good to hear. I mean, okay, I don't really care. I mean, obviously, the tank role being slightly less cumbersome is not a bad thing if you ask me. Again, this all comes back to a question that is fundamentally flawed. The tank pool is not really small. I mean, at least from what I've seen, it's very even right now. It feels like tanks and healers are both in high demand. This is like a legacy mindset, I think. This is like for LFG dungeons, and it even kind of says that, so it's not great. I don't really understand the question, and I can only hope it was asked by somebody who actually does Mythic Plus, because for me as a tank, I have a lot of trouble getting into groups, and I would imagine that is because there's a lot of other tanks out there. Like, I get it, I'm not the best player, and I do maybe some things that people don't like, but in the if there was an actual drought of tanks, like if there was no tanks, these guys wouldn't really have a lot of options. You know what I mean? Like, I think I'd be getting invited more often. So I don't think that's true. And, people have told me it's not true, but I only tank, so I don't actually know. And this is where it gets really freaking weird. Really, really, really weird. In Wrath, we had the little LFG bag. Dude, that was to get people to queue for content. You know that, right? This is not what you want from Mythic Plus. Please, 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 please don't actually do this. What a terrible, terrible suggestion. Yes, there's an interesting question. I think there are challenges in thinking how that would apply to pre-made content. Yes, exactly. Where the limit is most keenly felt, like forming Mythic Plus groups or who is going to tank for a raid pug. But where possible, we want to make sure that people who are interested in being the tank and being responsible for their survival and leading the group are feeling appreciated and rewarded for that. And again, it comes down to the game 1 and the game 2 thing. I mean, to me, dude, game 1 perfectly rewards tanks. It's perfect. That doesn't need to change. It's a very empowering feeling for me to be in charge of the group, for me to feel, like I'm leading the group to success with my success and my failures. They're a ripple down effect to everyone else. And I will say, the ego comes out when I can solo these packs and these bosses that everybody else is dying to. It's just, just how it works for me. It's a flaw maybe, but that's just how it is. And I think that's perfect. It doesn't need me. I don't need to like feel like I'm getting extra rewards, or like I don't need some incentive to want to tank. Okay. So honestly, if you do, you probably don't like tanking. I mean, that's just the way I look at it. It's game 2, like we talked about in yesterday's video, that starts to become the problem, the social side of things. That's when you start running the tanks out. And, again, this is just not something that Blizzard is going to fix, because they just don't care about the social side of things. They basically completely divorce themselves from it. And it's just how it is. So adding a freaking gold bag, a bag with like runes in it or something like that, yo, that would be awful, because then you would literally have people just signing up to get the reward and they would not care about the content at all. Now, that works when we're talking about the Oculus, the LFG Oculus, but that does not work when you're talking about difficult Mythic Plus content. You do not want your tank in there for some tertiary reward that's not even related to the dungeon. Wow, that is the worst idea I have ever heard. And that is really disappointing to hear. You had 4 questions to ask the guy, and this was one of them. I really hope I'm missing something here, because that is just, God, that is an awful, awful suggestion. Anyway, a common criticism among players is having to do content they don't like in order to do content that they do like, such as Mythic Plus and rating interactions. Is that a problem to solve? And if it is, how are you doing it in Dragonflight? I have not read this answer yet. Can't wait to read it. I think it's certainly a problem to solve, as stated by those players. At the end of the day, one of the shifts that we made over the course of Shadowlands, I think, was re-examining some of our philosophies, assumptions on interconnectedness of rewards, and how important it is for all players to need to do certain systems or certain pieces of the game versus taking a step back and just letting people focus on what they prefer to focus on, while encouraging them and giving them optional rewards for branching out. It's a really good way to look at it. That's actually a really good answer. So I think that what we saw in Eternity's End, the final major patch for Shadowlands, was some of those philosophies in action after 9.15. If you look at the endgame of Shadowlands today, there's plenty of content in the outdoor world and Zereth Mortis that is there for those who want to engage deeply with it. We have an entire cipher system that you can unlock improve your ability to interact with and traverse the environments to make them more effective in combat, but none of that is making you better in raids and dungeons. We wanted to get away from the sense of a checklist of weekly or daily chores of, all right, I have to do this thing or I'm going to fall behind and let my raid group down. We've seen and heard good feedback and seen success. And you know what? There are plenty of people running around Zereth Mortis, and there are enough people who enjoy that content on its own right that it could stand on its own. That's really great to hear that, actually. I'm surprised to hear them actually say that. One of our pillars is really, as much as possible, let people play the game they want to play it. Don't require them to do things that they don't enjoy in order to compete or have access to the things they do. This remains a guiding principle. Will we have a 100% success rate? It's impossible to, and I'm going to explain to you why in a second. Not necessarily. And there are some things that, like, if you don't want to level, yes, fucking Christ. I literally was just about to say that. Sorry, you have to level. That's pretty funny. We want to have everyone in a baseline understanding of the shared word, the story, the stakes, and the characters you are going through the world. But if you want to hit max level and then spend most of your time pushing mythic keys and not worry about getting your renown levels up in different zones, okay, you'll miss out on some cool cosmetics and rewards and items, but you'll have better or equal items for mythic dungeons, and that's fine. Choose your path. Okay, cool. Good answer. A bit of a cop out, I feel like. The real answer is this. We've tried to do this over and over again, and players keep inventing new ways to min max the game. And this is actually, we made a video on this back in 915 as well. And this is actually a big problem with the game. In 915, and you could talk about the Maw and some things. They weren't great, man. They weren't. I did not like them. I did not do them. Okay. So that's pretty much all you need to hear. I didn't do them. I didn't enjoy them, and I still don't. Okay. But they are optional. It's just a fact. I mean, it's just facts. Whether you want to hear it or not, it's facts. There is no attunement from Zereth Mortis, right? Do you know what attunements are? A lot of people probably don't. In the old days, to even enter the dungeons, to enter heroic slave pens, to enter Karazhan, to enter Molten Core, you had to do a physical activity in the video game that would otherwise prevent you from entering if you did not complete. Physical barrier to entry. Actually cannot enter it. That's what is reality, okay? What is not reality is if I don't have this 0.5% DPS upgrade to my conduit, I suck. That's not reality, okay? You're making a problem that doesn't exist. And that's, we talked about that in the previous video. So I'm glad that they don't really worry about that as much, but I'm also glad that they also recognize that, like, hey, this is their perspective probably, right? They're like, okay, everybody's upset about this. It's just not a big deal. We'll just remove it. Like, that's pretty much what they did. You know what I mean? They're like, okay, yeah, you guys didn't like conduits. We'll just get rid of them. So that's probably good for a lot of people because they're not like psychologically bolstered enough to understand that the reality there was something that was in their own head. The situation there was in their own head. But it's actually a bad thing overall because now you just have less power you can gain. And so I'm actually kind of worried about this for Dragonflight because if none of these systems exist, how do you gain power when you hit a wall? Like, this is why I always loved Titan Forging and why I loved all the systems that they eventually removed. Because I could always gain power. For the entire 8 months of a season, power can still be gained. So they basically removed a bunch of the systems that actually worked extremely well in Legion and BFA. Mostly because confused people were just saying things that were illogical and they just didn't want to deal with it probably anymore. So they got rid of them. And then they put in these insanely weak systems, like awful systems, like conduits, to be honest. It's a good system if it was more interesting, but it's just not. So it's just a weak system compared to like, essences or corruption, you know what I mean? And then people still can't divorce them. Like they still can't separate it, right? They're like, yo, this system is weak. And everybody knows it, right? It's literally like the conduits are being listed on websites as like a 0.1% DPS increase from level to level. It's actually like not even a statistically significant DPS increase. And people are still going out of their way to kill themselves in Zereth Mortis doing content. Or it was in Korthia, killing themselves in Korthia to get conduits that they don't even need. Like, again, if you're playing the game at a level where these like barely total 1% DPS increases are stopping you from killing the content, then you're actually just one of the best players in the world. That's not the game anybody else is playing. At no point is me, as the player I am, going to be held back by conduits. And that's because they made a bad system. And then the players were like, so this is what I'm saying when it's impossible. Why is it impossible? Well, also the leveling thing, because there's always going to be things mandatory. Like you have to log on to the game to play it, right? Like there's always something that's mandatory. But the other thing here is that they just can't do that because the players are inventing these problems. Like Blizzard actually was like, hey, we're going to take all these crazy grinds out of the game because you guys seem to not want them, but we'll leave something in there for people who have a lot of extra time and maybe they want to try to get power. And instead, just like I said in yesterday's video, people look at that and they're like, oh, that's how the top world players are doing it? I guess I have to do that too. I actually hate it though, and it's going to make me really, really unhappy. But this is what some guy with 2K viewers is doing on Twitch, so I guess it's mandatory. And it's really disappointing because it's like, I don't know how you fix that, to be honest. You can't blame like Max for doing, it's like he's doing what he needs to do, wants to do, and everybody else is like, oh, I need to do that too. It's like, no, no, you don't, dude. You know what I mean? You're not even like a top 100 raider in the world. Like, why? You don't need to do that. So they're going to remove all that. What's it going to look like in Dragonflight? Are we going to get to a point where literally you can just log on, gear up for 2 or 3 weeks, and then that is actually it for power gains? I hope not, but I think it will be that way. And you know what? It's probably fine. Let's just move on from it because it's you're not going to convince these people that they shouldn't do this stuff. They just don't understand. They don't have the healthy perspective they need. So just have to move on, and you protect the people from their own mistakes. Let's put it that way. And it's not on, not like the other conversation we had yesterday. This one is very benign. It just doesn't matter. The system's trended in such a way that they almost were irrelevant anyway. So I just hope that it's fulfilling and that playing my main DK will be enjoyable for a long period of time. But if not, we'll always have leveling challenges. So thank you for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.